if somebody hasn't read your book yet, how would you describe it to them?
So it's a detective story that is set in and around Johannesburg. Really, it goes from the top to the bottom of Gauteng, and it follows a series of murders that are being investigated by, in fact, they're a couple, but they're investigating the murders in different capacities. One of them is a former police officer called Ian Jack, and he gets roped in when a dead body is found on the edge of the Hartbeespoort Dam, and his partner is Police Captain Reshma Patel, and she gets called in when there's a grisly discovery in the tunnels underneath Park Station. And so this story really follows their investigation of where these bodies come from and whether or not there's a link between them.
So the story is very centered around cash and transit heists, which is something as South Africans we're very familiar with. Where did the idea for the story come from?
So this is the second book featuring Ian Jack and Reshma Patel, and the first one came out 2 years ago. It's called Knucklebone, and both of the stories do have an element of the supernatural to them. It's not that heavy in three bodies, but it's very definitely there. This isn't kind of ghosts and like Stephen King spookiness. It's really, from my perspective, the type of supernatural that is very much part of our everyday in Johannesburg, or at least many people's everyday. So the idea for Three Bodies started when I was finishing writing Knucklebone several years ago, and I was consulting with a Sangoma who at the time was living in Maboneng, and we had a discussion around a whole number of things. And one of the topics that came up was the idea of there being mermaids in the Hartbeespoort Dam. Specifically, though, that it was sort of water spirits that were actually trapped in the Hartbeespoort Dam. And when I went back to consult with Masangoma again, in fact, I consult with a number of Isangoma for the book as readers and to help me kind of get some of the technical aspects right. We were talking about it again, and I said, but why would somebody do that? Why would somebody sort of hold a spirit against their will? What would you need this for? And she just looked at me and she said, battle magic. And as soon as that came up, when you talk about battle magic in a South African contemporary context, what you mean is the big guns of cash and transit heists. So that was where the heists came in. They weren't originally part of the plot, but once we kind of discussed what that type of really, really dark magic would be used for, that's how they came in.
How much research did you have to do for this book?
So I did quite a lot of research onto cash and transit heists, and obviously the areas that I write about in the book, many of them I'm familiar with through years of working as a journalist, or I've had other work associations in different parts of Gauteng. The cash and transit heists, I spent quite a long time looking at footage of different heists that was available online, reading reports about investigations into heists. And my main resource was an absolutely brilliant book that I highly recommend by also another journalist, Annelies Burgess, who wrote, it's called Heist. And she really just took an incredibly detailed and very easy to read view into this world of kind of all the people behind the cash and transit heist, the police officers, the security officers involved, all the special measures they had to take to investigate it. And so Heist became a really invaluable resource for me, and also pointed me towards a lot of other resources that I could find.
There, for me, was also a real sense of the importance of place in your novel. So the sense of place in Joburg, for example, I mean, you go into Park Station and underneath Park Station, and also Hartbeespoort Dam, which we're very familiar with if you live in Gauteng. So talk to me about the importance of place and that sense of space in your work.
So the first two big books that I wrote were history books. I mean, most of my work is nonfiction. And I've always really resonated with the idea that history doesn't just take place along a timeline, but actually takes place in physical locations. So for me, the physicality of a story always tells you part of the story. You know, when a story takes place in a working class suburb or in part of the CBD, it's as if the story is literally carved into the streets and the buildings that are placed there. And so it's important for me to reflect that. I also think that the spaces in Gauteng that I've used in particular have an inherent aspect of darkness to them. We know, so Knucklebone, my first novel, starts off in a very ordinary suburban house. and something bad happens there. But even if you live in the suburbs, I think anybody who's woken up at 3 a.m. with a strange noise will know that the suburbs are really just a shadow away from being a dark place. At the same time, Park Station can, and at one point was, shiny and new and incredible, but also there are literally these tunnels buried beneath there. And there are stories and similar, metaphorical tunnels buried beneath the entire city center. Again, with the Val Dam, where you have these resorts and these beautiful kind of perfect little houses along the edges of the river, but it's also contrasted with that, with industry and smoke, and then a couple of kilometers away from, in fact, where some of the events are set in this book was Sharpeville, or is Sharpeville, is the Sharpeville police station. So everywhere you go in South Africa, but I mean in Gauteng, which I know best, is kind of you have to understand that there's a history that underlies the geography, and that is inherently part of your story when you tell it. For me, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I also wanted to talk to you about, you mentioned that you started off writing the history books, but what drew you to crime fiction? Why pursue this genre?
I've always read crime fiction and science fiction. So I'll be writing books about dragons next. In fact, no, I have actually already. They just haven't been published by anyone. I've loved crime stories since I was a kid, and that ranges from Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators to Michael Connelly, obviously Agatha Christie, Raymond Chandler, Sarah Paretsky. I'm a really big sort of detective story reader, and I love the twists and the turns of the whodunit, and I love the characters of the investigators themselves, of particular people. So I resonate quite strongly with characters that are a little bit rough, maybe a little bit flawed, but also have a strong sense of justice. Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned science fiction as well, because I'm a real fan of genre fiction. So I love crime fiction, love science fiction. So talk to me about the importance of genre fiction, because there are some people who would scoff at genre fiction. It's not literary enough, according to them. So talk to me about the importance of writing genre fiction.
Gosh, that sounds like a criticism of my entire life. I mean, when I was a kid and I read a lot, like I would read very fast, and I would want to go off to the bookstore, and there weren't a lot of bookstores in those days. And, once a month I'd be allowed to go and choose a novel. And eventually my parents were like, okay, you can have one dragon book, but you also have to buy something else. And I've constantly been told that, my literary tastes were not very literary and were very lowbrow, because I like things with spaceships and dragons and elves and whatever it is. Which really annoys me. In fact, there's no reason that kind of Jeffrey Eugenides is a more important read than Anne McCaffrey or Ursula Le Guin, or, these are people who have built up incredibly rich worlds. And for me, the best science fiction writers in particular are really anthropologists in a way, and they see society so much more clearly than many great literary fiction writers. So I think that, first of all, there is no such thing as a bad book. Even Dan Brown, even 50 Shades of Grey, reading is reading, and you can't sit there and say, oh, well, you're not a good person because you read something that I don't think is high enough for me. And I also think that people are hypocrites. I was literally mocked for reading science fiction and fantasy most of my life. And then Game of Thrones came out, and suddenly everybody was like, oh, but I love dragons. So I think that what it comes down to is fantastic storytelling. And I do think that fantasy at the moment is maybe not as rich as it could be. It goes through kind of ruts. But what I'm seeing emerge in kind of science fiction and what people like to call speculative fiction now is really insightful, provocative works that also, these are the first works often that have dealt with issues of gender, not being binary, that have dealt with racism in often oblique ways, but often direct ways. Even if you look at Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad, that's speculative fiction. He's almost done a time travel twist on historical events, and it's genius. So, if you want to kind of dismiss, all of these things are important, and they add to a much richer bracket of storytelling. And I suppose our earliest stories and tales were myths and legends. We told them, to share community. And those stories often involved mysticism and spirits and demons and, gods and other things. So they're still a very, very important part of kind of how we define our little pockets of society. And I think they make our bookshelves, and I'm trying to stare at your bookshelf behind your picture, but they make our bookshelves so much richer than these kind of honestly quite up their own, bum kind of literary works, which are often impossible to read. And you kind of sit there and they gather cobwebs. And I kind of made it through the first chapter, but couldn't wade any deeper. Just read what you like. And I like dragons and spaceships and crime.
I'm glad you do, because I love it as well. Talk to me about your writing process. I kind of asked this of every author that I interview, because I find it really fascinating, because you're all so different in the way that you write, how you come up with ideas, and then how you put the metaphorical pen to paper, because you're going to be typing it on a computer very likely. But how is your how is your writing process evolved, and how do you go about it?
So I'm getting better as I go. And this is an important thing for people to understand if they're interested in the writing process. I started off as a journalist. I still work as a journalist. I teach journalism. And I went from having to write, sort of 25 years ago, we used to write 4,000, 6,000 word stories. These days, they're 400 and 600 word stories. But you go from writing short pieces of text eventually to longer pieces. And it's a bit like building up a muscle, or training for a marathon. You can't go from running 1 kilometer to suddenly running 42. You have to build up that kind of endurance. And so I am finding that the more I write, the better I get at that endurance aspect of writing a full-length manuscript. When I was writing Three Bodies, the process was pretty interesting, because I was under quite a lot of pressure in terms of deadlines. I just finished my PhD, so I had just finished writing 110,000 word thesis, and I had no words left in me. So I really had to go back to this muscle, this writing muscle that I'd had developed. I couldn't wait for the muse to somehow get into a spaceship and land in my study. And so I had to clearly structure kind of what I wanted to do each day, and make sure that I carved out times, morning, afternoon, evening, where I could write, even if it was 500 words or 1,000 words, to kind of set myself word-based targets. I'm also not one of those writers that likes to plot everything out in minute detail. I know that works very well for some people. But for me, I need a short-term destination and then a kind of a final destination. Often when I write fiction, I know the end, or at least I have an idea of the end. I'm just not sure how the characters are going to get there. And what becomes exciting is, as the manuscript gets closer and closer towards the end, it's almost like a treat waiting for me, like the dessert at the end of a meal, where I know I finally get to write that end scene. And I look forward to it. But I can't, when you're only halfway through the book, and anybody who's written a full-length book will know the first 20,000 words are often easy. And then you sit there at 20,000 words, and you're like, I have nothing left to write, and I've still got to write another 60,000 words. What am I going to do? But as you start sort of hitting 60, 70,000 words, the excitement, the anticipation of that climax at the end is an incentive to carry on. So I just had to be very diligent, though, and make sure that I sat and wrote every single day. And even if it meant the next day I had to undo some of what I'd written, that was okay. And yeah, it was really just, this was very much about exercising a muscle. This wasn't about dreaming and having lots of time. This was about finishing a book to deadline. And it worked out really well, because I knew the characters, I knew the spaces, I knew the crimes that they were investigating. So I think that also helped with my writing process. If, you don't, when they say write what you know, I don't think that means write yourself. You can learn to know you can come to know other things through research. And because I knew what I was writing about fairly well, it allowed me a lot of freedom so that I could actually move through the plot and explore different avenues and see which ones worked and which ones didn't.
I'm not sure if this is a fair question, seeing as your book has just been published, but are you working on anything new?
So I have a second book that's actually out this year, which is a nonfiction work on femicide, which is based on the research I did for my doctoral thesis. And that relates quite strongly to some of the themes in Three Bodies. So, the issue of violence against women is unfortunately something that is ever present. And I worked on researching femicide for the last 7-8 years. So obviously that was going to filter into my novel in quite a strong way. At the moment, I am not working on any full-length new books, but I do have a couple of plans in mind. And I think the pandemic made it really hard. I had this idea at the beginning of lockdown that I was just going to read and write, and it was going to be this amazing, like a little writer's retreat, in my own house. but I found I had absolutely no motivation, and I could barely even read. I've literally only started reading books again in the last 3 weeks. So, and that's very hard for me as a really kind of committed lover of books for my entire life. So I'm going to go easy on myself for not having written another novel during lockdown. But not that there's any light at the end of the tunnel now, but maybe I'm just getting more used to living in these kind of circumstances. I am trying to keep myself motivated by planning, what do I want to do next year? So I'm planning some nonfiction research projects as well as a couple of other fiction ideas, but we'll see. I don't like to talk about fiction ideas until they're actually done. I'm a bit superstitious like that.
Totally understandable. Totally understandable. Keep them close to your heart.
Yeah. Otherwise, the tendency is with stories in particular, is you sit with your friend, maybe you have a few too many glasses of wine one night and you kind of ramble out your entire story that's been living in your head. And once you've let the story out, it's gone. And then you don't need to write the book anymore because you've told it. So stories are a little bit like a piece of magic themselves. So sometimes you have to feed it quite carefully if you want to be able to turn it into a book. I'm sure that's not very scientific, but yes.
No, but writing is magic. So I think that's a good analogy to have. Nechama, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I really, really enjoyed your book. I haven't read Knucklebone, but now that I've read 3 Bodies, it makes me want to go back and read Knucklebone very much.
So Knucklebone is about animal poaching. So yeah, it's the same characters, very, very different setup, and very interesting. So I think, yes, take a read, and I hope you enjoy it.
I'm sure I will. Thanks again. Much appreciated.
Thank you.